Something is happening behind the scenes of Michael 2, and it's bigger than anyone expected. Just months after Michael became the highest-grossing music biopic in history, Lionsgate has confirmed the sequel is moving forward. Jaafar Jackson is coming back. But this time, everything is different. The pressure, the timeline, the story he has to tell. We're breaking down everything that's confirmed, everything that's rumored, and why this sequel might be the hardest thing Jaafar Jackson has ever done. If you want more untold Hollywood stories like this, hit subscribe before we start. On August 6th, 2026, during Lionsgate's fiscal earnings call, something fans had been waiting months for finally happened. Motion Picture Group Chairman Adam Fogelson stood in front of investors and confirmed what everyone suspected. Michael 2 is real. It's happening. And it's happening sooner than anyone predicted. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a leak. This was the studio itself on the record, telling the world that Jaafar Jackson is putting the makeup back on. Fogelson said the studio is targeting production for late 2026 or early 2027. A release is being planned for the end of 2027, possibly slipping into the first half of 2028. That means in a matter of months, Jaafar Jackson goes from press tours and red carpets back into a makeup chair for hours at a time, back into choreography rehearsals, back into becoming his uncle all over again. But here's what makes this different from every other sequel announcement in Hollywood. Michael wasn't just a hit. It broke records. The film crossed $1 billion at the global box office. That number alone puts it above Bohemian Rhapsody, above Elvis, above every music biopic ever made. Michael is now officially the highest-grossing biopic in film history, and the man at the center of that record-breaking film had never acted in his life before this role. That's the story everyone remembers. What people are only now starting to process is this. The second film has to live up to that. And living up to a billion-dollar debut is a different kind of pressure than making one. Let's actually sit with those numbers for a second, because they explain everything about why this sequel got greenlit so fast. Michael was made on a budget somewhere between $155 and $200 million. A serious investment for a biopic. A genre that studios usually treat with caution, because music biopics are notoriously unpredictable at the box office. Most don't cross 300 or 400 million worldwide. Michael didn't just clear that bar. It obliterated it, pulling in figures that put it in the same conversation as major franchise tentpoles, not other music biopics. Delayed release dates, a troubled production history, a film that critics openly called sanitized. None of that stopped audiences from showing up in record numbers, in theater after theater, market after market. That combination, a flawed film that still broke records because of one specific performance, is exactly the kind of data point that makes a studio move fast on a sequel. Lionsgate didn't wait around, wondering if there was appetite for more Michael Jackson story. The opening weekend already answered that question. Which brings us back to Jaafar. When a film succeeds because of the story, a sequel is a business decision. When a film succeeds specifically because of one actor's performance, despite the story's flaws, a sequel becomes a bet on that actor personally. That's the position Jaafar Jackson is in right now, whether he asked for it or not. Let's talk about what changed. When Jaafar Jackson was cast as Michael Jackson back in January 2023, nobody knew what they were getting. He wasn't a trained actor. He had no film credits. He was a singer with 2 small singles to his name, and he was about to be asked to carry the most scrutinized biopic of the decade, playing arguably the most famous entertainer who ever lived in front of a family that would be watching every frame. That was a gamble, a 2-year audition process, years of preparation. Nobody was certain it would work. Now flip that. The first film was out. It made over $1 billion. Critics who tore the movie apart still turned around and praised Jaafar's performance specifically. He proved he could do this. So here's the shift nobody's talking about enough. The first Michael was a discovery story. The sequel is an expectation story. And those are not the same thing to live up to. When you're unknown, failure is forgivable. When you've already delivered the highest grossing biopic of all time, failure isn't an option anymore. Every single choice Jaafar makes in Michael 2, his voice, his posture, the way he holds a microphone, will be compared directly to a performance the world already fell in love with. That's the real transformation happening right now, not just physical, psychological. To understand what's coming in the sequel, you need to understand what already happened in the first film. Bill Corso, the Oscar-winning makeup artist, led the transformation team for Michael. Corso and his team built approximately 30 distinct looks for Jaafar throughout that single movie, each one requiring its own combination of makeup, hairstyling, and costume work to move convincingly between different eras of Michael Jackson's life, from the Jackson 5 years all the way through the solo stardom of the 1980s. Corso has spoken about how meticulous that process was. Small, layered details, look by look, built from historical photographs and archival family footage rather than guesswork. The goal was never caricature. It was authenticity, down to the smallest gesture. Here's why that matters for the sequel. The first film ended with the 1987 Bad Tour. If Michael 2 is going to cover new ground, and every signal from Lionsgate suggests it will, that means Jaafar has to be transformed into a version of Michael Jackson the first film never touched. Longer hair, a different bone structure emphasis as makeup techniques evolve the look, a more mature, more weathered presence that reflects a Michael Jackson who has lived through fame most people can't comprehend. This is where the online chatter comes from. Fans scrolling through old Jaafar Jackson photos and set-adjacent posts have started speculating that his real-life look is already shifting. Hair growing out, subtle style changes. And reading that as evidence, he's beginning to physically prepare for the next era of the character. Nothing has been officially confirmed by Lionsgate on that front. But the instinct isn't unreasonable. Corso's team started designing the first film's looks long before cameras rolled. If Michael 2 is filming within the next year, prep work for a transformation this demanding likely has to start now, quietly, long before any official footage goes public. So when people say Jaafar is already transforming, what they usually mean is this. The machinery behind that transformation, the historical research, the reference photography, the early makeup tests, is almost certainly already underway, even if nobody outside the production has seen it yet. And that speculation hasn't stayed quiet. Since the Lionsgate earnings call, fan forums and comment sections have filled up with side-by-side comparisons. Old photos of Jaafar next to archival Michael Jackson, images from the early 90s, with people picking apart hairlines and jaw angles like forensic evidence. Some of it is reaching, some of it is genuinely interesting. But all of it points to the same thing. The appetite for this sequel is already enormous, months before a single frame has been shot. That's rare. Most sequels have to build anticipation through marketing. This one is generating it for free, purely off the strength of what the first film already proved. This is the part that changes everything about what kind of movie the sequel actually is. The first Michael ended at the height of the Bad Tour in 1987 and 1988. If the sequel picks up from there, the next chapter of Michael Jackson's life is the Dangerous Era, the 1991 album, the 1992 to 1993 Dangerous World Tour, a period when Michael Jackson's appearance, his persona, and the media's relationship with him had all shifted dramatically. That's a harder era to portray than anything in the first film. The lighting is different, the public mood around Michael Jackson is different, and crucially, this era leads directly into the moment the first film very deliberately avoided. In 1993, Michael Jackson was accused of child sexual abuse by Jordan Chandler. The case was eventually settled out of court, and that settlement came with a legal clause, one that barred any depiction or mention of Chandler or the allegations themselves in any future film project. That clause is the reason the first Michael movie ends where it does. According to Variety's reporting on Lionsgate's earnings call, the film's original script actually had an entire third act built around the police raid on Neverland Ranch. But during production, the estate's lawyers discovered that old settlement clause and realized it legally prevented them from depicting or even referencing Chandler or the allegations in any form. The filmmakers were forced to scrap that entire ending and reshoot the film's finale, ultimately closing the story on the Bad Tour instead, a full 5 years before the allegations even happened. That single legal detail explains one of the most criticized aspects of the first film. Reviews called Michael sanitized. Critics accused it of dodging the most controversial and consequential chapter of its subject's life. And now, if the sequel's timeline moves forward into the 1990s the way every report suggests it will, the story is going to walk directly toward the exact chapter the first film was legally barred from telling. That doesn't mean the allegations will suddenly be depicted on screen. The settlement clause, as reported, still exists. But it does mean the sequel has almost no way to avoid the subject entirely if it wants to tell an honest story about who Michael Jackson became in the 1990s. Fogelson himself has publicly acknowledged there's a massive amount of Michael Jackson's life and music beyond the allegations that could fill a second film on its own, which reads less like a denial and more like a studio carefully choosing its words. Think about what the Dangerous Era actually represents in Michael Jackson's story, because it's not just the next chapter chronologically, it's the turning point. Off the Wall and Thriller made him the biggest star on the planet. Bad cemented that. But Dangerous is where the public narrative around Michael Jackson started to shift, where the tabloid obsession intensified, where his physical appearance became a constant subject of media speculation, and where the image of eccentric started curdling into something the press treated very differently. Portraying that shift accurately requires more than a wig and a different jacket. It requires an actor willing to sit inside genuine public scrutiny and discomfort on screen, to let the audience feel the weight of a world that had started turning on someone at the exact moment his art was reaching its most ambitious. That's a fundamentally harder acting challenge than anything the rise to fame structure of the first film demanded. Rising to stardom is a story audiences love watching unfold. Watching a beloved figure absorb public suspicion and judgment is a story audiences have to be convinced to sit through, and it only works if the performance underneath it is completely convincing. Here's a detail most casual fans missed completely. According to Fogelson's comments on the earnings call, Lionsgate has a number of sequences, specifically some large-scale musical performance sequences, that were already filmed during production of the first Michael, but never made it into the final cut. Those sequences are almost certainly going to be incorporated directly into Michael 2. Think about what that actually means. Some of what you'll see in the sequel wasn't filmed for the sequel at all. It was filmed years ago, shelved, and is now being repurposed because it happens to fit the story the second film needs to tell. That's not just cost saving. That's evidence the filmmakers always knew the story was bigger than one movie could hold. This is also why the production timeline for Michael 2 can move faster than a typical sequel. They're not starting entirely from zero. Some of the biggest, most expensive sequences to shoot, full-scale concert recreations, may already exist in a vault somewhere, waiting to be dropped into the new film. There's a financial angle here, too, that studios rarely explain out loud, but Fogelson essentially did on that earnings call. Concert sequences are among the most expensive things a biopic can shoot. Full sets, full choreography teams, live audiences, complex sound design. If a chunk of that expensive work is already in the can from years ago, the sequel's actual production budget could be lower than expected relative to its scale, even while the on-screen spectacle looks just as massive as the first film. That's part of why Lionsgate can afford to move on this so quickly, despite still not having locked a final budget number according to Fogelson's own comments to investors. The financial case for Michael 2 was arguably being built years before anyone announced it. To understand the pressure Jaafar Jackson is under, you have to understand this was never just a role to him, it's family. When Jaafar was first cast, his grandmother, Michael Jackson's mother, Katherine Jackson, publicly said she approved of the choice, describing Jaafar as embodying her son and carrying on the Jackson family's legacy of entertainers. That's not a casual endorsement. That's the matriarch of one of the most famous families in music history putting her name behind her grandson, stepping into her son's shoes in front of the entire world. The first film wasn't just judged as a movie, it was judged as a tribute. Every Jackson family member who showed up to that premiere was watching to see if Jaafar got it right. Not just the dance moves, not just the voice, but something harder to name, the essence of who Michael actually was. He got it right. The family celebrated the film's success publicly. Jaafar became, almost overnight, the person the Jackson family trusts to carry their most famous relative's story forward. That trust didn't come easily, and it wasn't guaranteed. Biopics about beloved musicians have a long history of dividing the artist's own family, some relatives supportive, others publicly critical of how their loved one was portrayed. Michael could easily have gone that way too. Instead, by most public accounts, the family closed ranks around Jaafar's performance specifically, even while some of them acknowledged the film itself wasn't perfect. That's a rare outcome, and it's almost entirely because of how Jaafar handled the responsibility, not because the material made it easy for him. Now here's the weight of that trust for the sequel. It's not just that Jaafar has to match his own performance from the first film. It's that an entire family is expecting him to do it. Again, this time walking into a much darker, much more complicated chapter of their relative's life. Get this wrong, and it's not just a bad sequel. It's a family legacy handled carelessly in front of the whole world for a second time. There's another name that matters just as much as Jaafar's in all of this, Antoine Fuqua. Fuqua directed the first Michael, and by every indication, he's expected to return for the sequel. That matters, because Fuqua is a director known for grounded, morally complicated storytelling, Training Day. While The Equalizer, Emancipation, he's not a filmmaker who typically shies away from difficult material, which makes the choices made in the first Michael even more interesting in hindsight. A director capable of handling darkness was working with a script that legally couldn't go there. That constraint is gone now, or at least loosened. The sequel's timeline pushes past the settlement clause's window of restriction. If Fuqua returns, he's no longer the director. Forced to end a story 5 years early because of a legal technicality. He's the director who finally gets to make the version of the story he was always capable of telling, assuming the studio and the estate are willing to let him go there. That's a genuinely rare position for a filmmaker to be in. Most directors don't get a second attempt at telling the harder, more honest version of a story they were legally blocked from finishing the first time. Fuqua might. While all of this was unfolding, Jaafar Jackson made a move that tells you exactly how he's thinking about his career. In early August 2026, Deadline reported that Jaafar had signed on to star opposite Will Smith in Supermax, an action thriller from Amazon MGM Studios and Miramax, directed by David Gordon Green. The film follows 2 FBI agents investigating a murder inside a maximum security prison, and it's set to begin filming in Australia this month. This is not a small casting decision. This is the industry testing whether Jaafar Jackson can be more than Michael Jackson. Here's the problem every actor faces after playing an icon this defining. Daniel Radcliffe will always carry Harry Potter with him, no matter what else he does. Robert Downey Jr. will always be linked to Iron Man in the public imagination, even with an Oscar on his shell F. Playing a role this iconic, this beloved, this culturally massive, tends to follow an actor for the rest of their career, whether they want it to or not. By taking Supermax, an action thriller with zero connection to the Jackson family story, Jaafar is making a clear statement. He's not waiting around to be typecast. He's building range before the sequel even starts filming. But here's the twist. No matter how many other roles he takes, Michael 2 will always be the film that defines whether he's a serious actor or a one-time phenomenon. Supermax proves he can headline something different. Michael 2 will prove whether he can do the hardest version of the role that made him famous, and do it again at an even higher level, with the whole world watching more closely than the first time. Let's be honest about something the marketing won't tell you. Michael was not a critical darling. Reviews frequently criticized the film for being overly sanitized, for softening its subject, for sidestepping the most serious controversies of Michael Jackson's life, a criticism that, as we now know, was partly a legal necessity rather than a creative choice. But there was one thing almost every critic agreed on, even the harshest ones. Jaafar Jackson's performance was the exception to every complaint. Reviewers repeatedly singled him out. His voice work, his physicality, the way he captured Michael's quiet, soft-spoken presence alongside a fierce, single-minded ambition underneath it. One widely cited review from Variety specifically praised how convincingly Jaafar embodied that contrast between gentleness and intensity. Outlets covering the film in India called his performance award worthy. That's an unusual position for a sequel to be born from. Usually, a sequel gets made because the whole film worked. This one is getting made largely because one performance was strong enough to carry a flawed film to $1 billion anyway. It's worth being specific about what the criticism actually targeted, because it wasn't the acting. It was almost entirely structural. Critics pointed to pacing issues in the film's back half. They pointed to a runtime that tried to compress 2 decades of a complicated life into just over 2 hours. And repeatedly, they pointed to the ending, a film that built towards something it then wasn't legally allowed to deliver, leaving the back half feeling incomplete by design rather than by choice. None of that criticism landed on Jaafar. If anything, reviewers seemed almost relieved to have something to praise unreservedly in a film they otherwise found frustrating. That's a specific kind of pressure to inherit. It means the sequel doesn't just need to fix the structural problems critics pointed out. Runtime, pacing, an ending that finally gets to land the way the first one couldn't. It needs to do all of that, while Jaafar somehow clears an even higher bar than the one he already cleared, because expectations for his performance have nowhere to go but up. Which means the pressure on Michael 2 isn't really about the story this time. It's specifically, personally, about Jaafar. If the sequel underperforms, there's no hiding behind the movie overall was well reviewed. Jaafar was the reason people forgave the first film's flaws. He has to be that reason again. Except this time, the story he's carrying is the one everyone already knows is coming. The controversial one. The one the first film legally couldn't touch. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention. The preparation for the first, Michael, took years. Jaafar trained with acting coach Angela Gibbs for a full year before choreography even started. He rehearsed until, by his own account, his feet were bleeding. He had to relearn how to breathe to match Michael's speaking voice. That process was slow, deliberate, and exhaustive by design. Now compare that to what he's facing next. Filming on Supermax begins in Australia this month. Production on Michael 2 is targeted for late 2026 or early 2027. That means Jaafar could be finishing one demanding physical role and stepping almost directly into the most emotionally difficult transformation of his career, on a dramatically compressed timeline compared to the years he had the first time. There's no 2-year audition process this time. No slow runway to build the character from scratch. He already knows how to play Michael Jackson physically. What he doesn't have is time to prepare for playing a version of Michael Jackson defined by scrutiny, controversy, and a public reckoning the first film never had to touch. There's a physical reality here too that's easy to overlook. Supermax is an action thriller. That typically means stunt work, physical conditioning geared towards speed and aggression, a completely different body language than the deliberate, controlled, almost balletic physicality Michael Jackson performances demand. Jaafar could realistically be transitioning from throwing punches on an Australian film set to relearning the precise control of a moonwalk and a spin in a matter of weeks rather than months. Actors talk about needing time to reset the body between physically demanding roles. Depending on how tight these 2 production windows end up being, he might not get that reset at all. That's the real transformation everyone should be watching for, not just longer hair or a different jawline contour. A compressed, high-pressure sprint toward playing the hardest chapter of a beloved uncle's life, with the entire world already convinced he can do it, which somehow makes the room for error even smaller. Let's put everything together. Michael 2 isn't just a sequel. It's the film that decides whether Jaafar Jackson has a career beyond his uncle's name. The first movie was a gamble that paid off spectacularly. An unknown actor, a 2-year audition, and a billion-dollar box office result nobody could have promised. The sequel doesn't get to be a gamble. It's an expectation now, built on a foundation that's already proven in front of critics who are already skeptical of the franchise, and a family that's already watching closely. He has to transform into an older, more weathered, more controversial version of Michael Jackson than anything the first film asked of him. He has to do it on a tighter schedule than he had before. He has to navigate a legal minefield around the most sensitive chapter of his uncle's public life. And he has to do all of that while the world compares every single frame to a performance that's already being called one of the best film debuts in recent memory. The first film was a discovery. This one is a test, not of whether Jaafar Jackson can play Michael Jackson. He's already answered that question. This is a test of whether he can do it again at an even higher level in the hardest chapter of the story, with the whole industry watching to see if he's a genuine star or a performance that happened once and can't be repeated. And there's one more layer to this that makes it different from almost any other sequel in Hollywood right now. This isn't a franchise built on fiction, where the worst outcome is a disappointed fan base. This is a real family's history, told through a family member about a relative who is no longer alive to have a say in how his own story gets finished. Every choice Jaafar makes carries weight that a normal sequel simply doesn't have to account for. He's not just protecting his own career this time. He's protecting how the next generation of the public understands his uncle during the exact chapter of his uncle's life that has been the most publicly misunderstood, the most tabloid distorted, and the most legally untouchable until now. That's not pressure. Most 20-something actors, 3 years into their first professional role, are built to carry. And yet, by every signal coming out of Lionsgate, that's exactly the position Jaafar Jackson is walking into next. So here's where things actually stand. Michael 2 is officially confirmed. Production is targeted for late 2026 or early 2027. The sequel will almost certainly move into the Dangerous era and the events that follow it. The exact chapter of the first film was legally forbidden from telling. Unused footage from the original production is expected to be folded into the new film, and Jaafar Jackson, fresh off signing on to star opposite Will Smith, is stepping right back toward the role that made him a star in the first place, this time with far less room for error. Nothing about that is a rumor. It's confirmed on the record from the studio itself. Whether the online chatter about his look already changing is real prep for the transformation, or just fans reading into old photos, that part we won't know for certain until Lionsgate says so. What we do know is this. The first Michael proved a first-time actor could carry a billion-dollar film purely on the strength of one performance. The second, Michael is going to ask that same actor to do something much harder. Walk into the one chapter of his uncle's life. The first film was legally forbidden to tell, on a shorter timeline, with a family watching, a studio expecting a repeat of history and an audience that already believes he's capable of anything. Whether that turns out to be the making of a genuine Hollywood career, or the moment the pressure finally becomes too much, that's the story Michael 2 is actually going to tell, whether it means to or not. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a comment telling us what era you think Michael 2 should focus on, and subscribe so you don't miss the next update the moment new details drop.